On an August evening in 2010, 36-year-old Rusty Snyderman could barely contain his excitement as he talked to a small group of people in his kitchen in Dunwoody, Georgia, an upscale suburb of Atlanta. Rusty and his wife Andrea had some friends over, and people were spread out across the large suburban home, laughing, eating, and drinking. But in the kitchen, Rusty was talking to Hemi Newman, who was his wife's boss, along with a couple other friends, about a new business that Rusty was launching. Rusty was lanky with short brown hair, and he could barely see without his glasses on. And when he talked about something that he was passionate about, he used his whole body. And Rusty was very passionate about this new business idea, so he was very animated as he spoke. He told his captive audience that his idea was to start a company that provided celebrity voicemail services. So basically, somebody could pay a famous actor or singer or athlete to create the outgoing voicemail message on the person who was paying's phone, or a friend's phone as a gift or something like that. To make this more clear, if I were to pay for this, I would have a voicemail that would say, "Hey, you've reached the voicemail of John Allen, leave a message after the beep," but instead of it being my voice, it would be some celebrity saying as much. Now, remember, this was several years before celebrity video services like Cameo would come out, so the people listening to this idea had never heard of anything like this before, and they thought it was absolutely brilliant. Hemi, who was an executive at General Electric, which is a big appliance company, liked the idea, but did raise some questions about overhead costs and stuff like that, and the other people that were listening, Rusty's friends, they wanted to know how would he get these famous people on board with the concept. And Rusty, who people said was a born entrepreneur, had an answer for all their questions. And he really believed that if he did this right, the company would grow and it would even become something potentially that was so big and successful that he could pass it down to his kids. And so as Rusty was talking about his big plan, his wife Andrea stepped into the kitchen and overheard what they were talking about, and she quickly kind of chimed in that, maybe if this business is as successful as Rusty thinks, they wouldn't even need to worry about their kids' future job prospects. Their 5-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son would be just set because of this great business. And even though she was sort of joking about this, being so committed to this totally succeeding, there was some truth to that. She really believed this was going to be a success, same as Rusty. But Andrea's excitement was more about her husband having something to focus on rather than the actual company he was going to build. Andrea had known Rusty had a great mind for business since they started dating back in college at the University of Indiana. And not long after graduating, Andrea had moved with Rusty while he earned a master's degree from Harvard Business School. They had gotten married soon after that, moved to Georgia when Rusty got a job offer, and they started their family. And initially, things went great for Rusty on the work front. A few years earlier, in 2007, he'd gotten a job as the chief financial officer for a large chain of daycares, and he was making a ton of money. But over the last year, Rusty had begun clashing with the men who owned the company, and so they ultimately fired him. And that had changed everything back at their home. Andrea, who had always been kind of a math whiz, went ahead and got a job, and a really good one, a well-paying job at GE to support the family, and Rusty, who was now out of work, became a stay-at-home dad. Andrea knew Rusty did not resent her at all, even though her job often required her to travel a lot and leave him alone with the kids, but she also knew Rusty loved working. And so now that he had this new idea for this celebrity voicemail company, she just felt like he seemed so much happier and in such a better place, way better than he had been over the past couple of months. In the kitchen, Andrea grabbed a soda out of the fridge and asked her boss and Rusty's friends if they needed anything. They said they were fine, so Andrea said okay. She turned around and headed into the other room to speak to some of the other guests. Later that night, after all the guests had gone, Rusty and Andrea cleaned up the house, and as they did, they talked about what a great time they'd had. They also got excited discussing an upcoming cruise they were going on in a few months, just the two of them. Their kids would be with their grandparents, and so Rusty and Andrea would finally have time to reconnect, just the two of them. Even though things had been kind of tough the last few months, they both felt good about where their lives were heading. And to their surprise, they actually felt sort of lucky to live in this town of Dunwoody, Georgia. Rusty and Andrea had grown up in the Midwest of the United States, and they had really worried they wouldn't fit in when they moved here to the South. But over the years, Dunwoody had proven to be the perfect place for them. Their house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac in this beautiful secluded neighborhood that backed right up to sprawling woods filled with oak and pine trees. And they were close enough to Atlanta to also enjoy all the city had to offer as well. But most importantly, to Rusty and Andrea, Dunwoody had a tight, supportive Jewish community, which was not the case for a lot of suburbs in the area. Rusty and Andrea credited the Jewish community for helping them adjust to life in the South, and for weathering challenges like when Rusty had lost his job. So Dunwoody felt like home, a great town to raise their kids in, and the right place for Rusty to launch this next phase of his career. But a little later that night, as Rusty worked on his business proposal at the kitchen table, something so strange, almost completely unbelievable, was happening in Dunwoody. It was something that nobody who lived in the small suburb would have ever imagined. A few minutes from Rusty and Andrea Snyderman's house, a driver sat in their parked car on the side of a neighborhood street. The car felt ice cold, but sweat dripped down the driver's face. They could feel their chest getting tight, and they heard this loud rumbling sound coming from their passenger seat. The driver shook their head. "Please don't let this happen to me again," but there was nothing the driver could do. The car rattled, a light flashed outside, and then the demon appeared in the passenger seat. The driver tried to hide their eyes, but they couldn't look away, like the demon was forcing the driver to stare at it. The demon's head nearly touched the roof of the car, and its legs were massive. It wore a dark cloak and hood, and when the driver looked at it, they felt like all hope inside of them was just draining away. The demon turned its head away from the driver and began to talk. Its voice was deep and powerful. The driver thought the demon actually sounded like the 1970s soul and R&B singer Barry White, who was famous for songs like "Can't Get Enough of Your Love, Babe." The driver trembled, but the demon said there was no need to be afraid. The driver had been chosen to carry out a mission. The driver begged the demon to please leave them alone, but the demon said the mission was too important to ignore. Suddenly, the whole car shook and light flooded in from all sides. The driver shielded their eyes again, but they also felt a perfect sense of calm coming over them. They looked back at the passenger seat, and now the demon was gone. In its place sat an angel wrapped in light. The angel spoke, and the driver thought immediately that it sounded just like Olivia Newton-John, the actress and singer who had starred in movie musicals like Grease and Xanadu. When the angel spoke, they said the driver really was the only one who could carry out this very important mission the demon had already mentioned. So the driver asked, "What's the mission?" The angel smiled and said members of the Snyderman family were in grave danger, and the driver had to protect them. On the morning of November 10th, so about 3 months after the angel and demon appeared in that driver's car, Andrea rushed into her kitchen, holding her 5-year-old daughter's hand. Rusty was in the kitchen helping their son finish his breakfast. Andrea and her daughter both gave Rusty a kiss and told him they'd see him later, and then they headed out to the garage. Whenever Andrea was not traveling, she always made a point to drive her daughter to kindergarten on her way to work. It was just another way for her to bond with her child. After they were gone, Rusty's son finished eating, and Rusty cleaned up the kitchen and then got his son dressed for preschool. At about 8:30 a.m., Rusty carried his son out to the silver Infiniti car parked in the garage, opened up the garage door, and then buckled the boy into his car seat in the back. But before Rusty closed the car door, he hesitated. A strange smell was coming from outside. Rusty couldn't tell if it was gasoline or something else, so he walked out of the garage and scanned the yard, and he saw something move out of the corner of his eye. Rusty turned to the side of the house, and he saw someone laying in the grass. He didn't know if this person was sleeping or hurt or what was going on, so he just shouted, "Hey, are you okay?" The person jumped up and just stared at Rusty. It was a man with a thick black mustache, and he wore a wool hat and earmuffs. Rusty immediately felt like something is wrong with this person, so he turned, ran back into his garage, hopped in the car, locked the doors, and then he pulled out into the street with his little son in back. And then, as Rusty began to drive away, he looked and saw this man with the earmuffs running down a long path that led to the woods behind the cul-de-sac. Rusty had no idea what any of this meant, so he just grabbed his phone and called 911. When the emergency operator picked up, Rusty told them what he had just seen and gave as good of a description as he could of the man with the earmuffs. Rusty also said he thought he smelled something like gasoline outside of his house right before he saw this guy. The operator told Rusty they would send a police unit over right away to look around, and Rusty said, okay, great, but he still had to drive his son to school, but right after that, he would come back home and be ready to talk to police. A few minutes later, Rusty arrived at the preschool and walked his son inside, and then afterward, he headed right back home. And when he got there, police officers, firefighters, and a workman from the gas company were all arriving as well. Rusty told his story to the police again, and they said other officers were already out looking for this man he described. Then, the gas company employee said Rusty's house did have a gas leak, but nothing had been tampered with. Whoever had been at the house in the front yard didn't appear to have caused the leak. It was just an odd coincidence. And the guy said he had fixed the leak already, and the gas company employees said, the leak was a very easy fix. Later that day, after all the emergency personnel and the gas company employee were all gone, Rusty still didn't have any real answers about who the heck that guy was. Officers said that, the guy with the earmuffs could have been a homeless person sleeping near his house, but that made no sense to Rusty. Things like that just didn't happen in this neighborhood. But police had said that until they found this guy with the earmuffs and the mustache, there really wasn't much they could do. So that night, when Andrea came home and Rusty filled her in about this guy, they talked about it and just said, all we can do is be super vigilant whenever they left the house. And they said they would do their best not to worry too much. They didn't want the kids to get a sense that their parents were scared of something. But Rusty admitted he was glad that he and Andrea were leaving town for their cruise soon, and that the kids would not be at the house either. They'd be with their grandparents. And Rusty hoped that, by the time they all came back home after the cruise, things would be back to normal in the neighborhood. Meaning, the guy with the earmuffs and the mustache has been found, and hopefully will not be back anytime soon. 8 days later, at 9 a.m. on November 18th, Rusty pulled up to his son's preschool. Rusty and Andrea had gotten back from their cruise a couple of days earlier, and Rusty felt rejuvenated. And nothing strange had happened at the house since they'd returned, so he hoped that the man lying in the grass was just some weird one-time occurrence. Rusty unbuckled his son from the car seat and led him into the preschool. And then Rusty chatted with a few other parents who were also doing drop-offs, and then a few minutes later, Rusty was headed back towards his car. However, when Rusty reached his car and opened up the driver's side door, he suddenly heard footsteps, and he glanced over his shoulder, and he saw a man with brown hair and a beard walking quickly towards him. Seconds later, screams rang out in the preschool parking lot as a silver minivan peeled out and sped away. One of the other parents ran over to Rusty's car where the scream had come from. The driver's side door was still open, and Rusty lay on the ground in a pool of blood. The woman could see Rusty was still breathing, so she screamed for help and then called 911. In the shopping center right next to the preschool, a woman happened to see what was going on, and so she immediately ran into a doctor's office that happened to be nearby. And right away, a doctor and a nurse darted out of that office, and they ran over to Rusty. The doctor quickly checked Rusty's pulse and then began administering CPR. And soon, the doctor heard an ambulance siren wailing down the street. By this time, people from inside the preschool who heard all this commotion had began running outside into the parking lot. But luckily, all of the children were outside behind the school and had no idea what was happening, including Rusty's son. The ambulance arrived and paramedics took over for the doctor, trying to keep Rusty alive. They got Rusty onto a gurney, into the ambulance, and then they sped towards the hospital. A few minutes later, Detective Andrew Thompson of the Dunwoody Police Department arrived at the preschool. He saw a few of his fellow officers trying their best to keep a growing crowd away from Rusty's car. Detective Thompson had been a cop in Atlanta for 8 years before moving here to Dunwoody, but he'd only been a detective for about 2 years. And he'd also never been the lead investigator on a potential homicide, and he knew that's what he had on his hands right now. Thompson got out of his car, he briefly spoke with the officers on site, and then began taking witness statements. The few people who had seen what happened all said the same thing. A man with brown hair and a beard stepped out of a silver minivan, walked right up to Rusty Snyderman, and shot him multiple times. Then the man with the beard got back in the minivan and drove off. Other than the man having a beard, the witnesses didn't notice anything that stood out about the shooter's appearance. But one witness said the shooter seemed remarkably calm considering what he did. He walked up calm as can be, shot Rusty, and then turned and calmly walked back to the van before leaving. Detective Thompson thanked all the witnesses for their help and then kind of gently told them to please step back, and then he and the other officers began searching the area right around Rusty's car. A trail of blood now stretched out almost 40 feet across the parking lot, and to the side of the blood trail near the car, the police found 4 brass bullet casings that they believed were fired from a semi-automatic .40 caliber or .44 caliber weapon. And then, not long after Thompson and the others had found these bullet casings, Thompson got word that Rusty had unfortunately passed away at the hospital. Thompson was now officially leading a homicide investigation for the first time. While Detective Thompson searched the preschool parking lot for more evidence, Rusty's wife, Andrea, sat at her desk in GE's Atlanta offices. A minute later, her phone rang, and she noticed the call was coming in from her son's preschool. And so Andrea immediately answered, and the preschool administrator on the other line sounded very upset. She said Andrea's son was just fine, but Andrea needed to come to the school immediately. So without thinking, Andrea grabbed her things and ran outside to her car, and as she was running towards it, she pulled out her phone and called her boss Hemi to let him know she was dealing with some kind of an emergency, and then she got in her car and sped back towards the suburbs. As soon as Andrea pulled into the preschool parking lot, she saw all these police officers who turned and looked at her, and immediately they walked right up to her, and so she rolled her window down, and they said, "You have to go to the hospital right now." Andrea demanded to know what was going on. Was her son really okay? And the police assured her her son was absolutely safe, but she still needed to go to the hospital right now. And when Andrea arrived at the hospital a few minutes later, there she would learn her husband had been gunned down in the preschool parking lot and had died shortly after. Detective Thompson spent most of the day in the preschool parking lot, working with the forensics team to see if there was any useful evidence they could find beyond just the bullet casings. But they didn't find much of anything else. So Thompson knew his biggest clues right then were that the killer had a beard and drove a silver minivan. None of the witnesses had gotten the license plate of this silver minivan, but Thompson had already called in an alert, so all the police departments in the area would be on the lookout for any vehicle that could possibly be a match. Thompson also arranged for a forensic sketch artist to meet with the witnesses and make a composite drawing of the shooter from all of their descriptions. By the time the sun set, Thompson already felt tired and a little overwhelmed, but he had no intention of stopping. So he got in his car and drove to Andrea and Rusty's house. Once he got there and parked his car, he stepped outside into the cool fall air. It was just above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And just a second later, he heard somebody calling his name. Thompson looked over and saw his boss, Sergeant Gary Cordellino, standing by his own car at the curb. Cordellino still wanted Thompson to take the lead on this case, but he knew the detective did not have a lot of experience working homicide cases, so he said he would just be there to help. Thompson thanked Cordellino for coming, and the two men walked up to the house together. Cordellino's strong New York accent was a major contrast to the soft southern drawl a lot of people in town spoke with. But just like Rusty and Andrea, Cordellino had come to consider this small town in Georgia home, even if he was originally an outsider from up north. Andrea opened up the front door, and it was clear she'd been crying. The detectives introduced themselves and asked if they could please come inside. But Andrea got a stern look on her face. She said her parents and her in-laws were there, and this was a house of mourning. She thought it was very disrespectful that the police would want to intrude so soon after her husband had died. But Detective Thompson was just not going to have this. He said they were investigating a murder, and they needed to ask her and the family some questions right now. But Andrea just repeated herself. The family was in mourning, and they had no intention of speaking to police right now. At this point, Thompson got an angry look on his face, and he was about to push Andrea further, but Sergeant Cordellino jumped in. He said they were very sorry for her and her family's loss, and then apologized to Andrea for disturbing her and her family at such a difficult time, and said they would come back the following day. Andrea's face softened, and then she thanked him and said she would be willing to talk to them tomorrow. She closed the door, and then the two detectives walked back towards their respective cars. Thompson couldn't believe what had just happened. Clearly, they needed to interview the victim's wife, like right now. But Cordellino told him that in his experience, grief could do some really strange things to people, and they were way better off not pushing Andrea right at this moment. Still, Cordellino did admit that it was worth noting that Andrea did not seem remotely eager to help. The following day, November 19, 2010, Detective Thompson and Sergeant Cordellino returned to Andrea and Rusty's house, this time with a warrant to search the premises. Andrea still did not seem thrilled to have the police in her home, and she thought the warrant was totally unnecessary, but she still led them into the kitchen, and she and her family sat down and spoke to them. Over the course of about 2 hours, the detectives met with Andrea, her parents, Rusty's parents, and his brother. And they all pretty much said the same thing. Rusty was a great guy, people who knew him loved him, and they just couldn't imagine who would want to hurt him. This didn't surprise Thompson and Cordellino. Families often painted their dead relatives in the best possible light. It's just what you do, it's your family. Andrea told the detectives she couldn't think of anybody who fit the description of the bearded man that witnesses had seen. Then after she said it, she immediately shook her head like she had just remembered something. She said in all of the chaos and grief, she'd almost forgotten something really huge. The detectives asked what she meant, and Andrea said about a week earlier, Rusty had seen this weird guy with earmuffs on and a mustache laying in their front yard for no reason right as he was taking their son to school. Rusty had been so freaked out by seeing this guy who kind of inexplicably ran away that he called the police and gave a description of the guy. And again, part of that description was saying that this guy had this big black mustache. Thompson and Cordellino looked at each other. It was definitely possible the man with the big mustache and the earmuffs had grown out a full beard, and then by the time he was shooting Rusty, that's what you saw, his full beard, and not just a mustache. So maybe the shooter really was the same person Rusty had seen in the front yard. They talked to Andrea a bit longer, and then at some point they told her they wanted to take her and Rusty's computers to be searched. And again, Andrea got very upset. Detective Thompson thought it was strange that she still seemed unwilling to do whatever it took to help police find her husband's killer. But the detectives, in truth, did not really need Andrea to give them permission because they had a warrant. So they took the computers, then they thanked Rusty's family for talking to them, and then they left. Back at the station, Thompson and Cordellino handed off the computers for forensic data analysis, and then they dug up the report Rusty had filed about this weird guy he'd seen in his front yard. At that point, the detectives only knew there was a guy with this big mustache who might also be the big bearded guy who shot Rusty. It was not much to go on, and nobody in Rusty's family or anybody from the preschool remotely recognized this bearded guy. Then, something came to Thompson. He remembered what one of the witnesses had said, that the shooter seemed to be utterly calm when he walked up and shot and killed Rusty. And so Thompson floated the idea that, what if the shooter was a professional hitman who somebody had hired to kill Rusty? That would make sense because nobody would know who he was, and maybe he was wearing a disguise or something, and he certainly would be very calm walking up to do the killing because this is what he did professionally. And surprisingly, Cordellino did not think this was a far-fetched idea at all. In fact, he said, if this guy Rusty saw in the yard was also the shooter, this hitman potentially, he could have been at the house that day tracking Rusty's movements and learning his routines, something a professional killer would likely do. And when the detectives began delving into emails and other information they had found on Rusty and Andrea's computers, the hired killer theory only began to make more sense. The detectives found that during his time working as a chief financial officer, Rusty had clashed repeatedly with the business owners. And based on the emails, he and Andrea were not shy about telling other people exactly how they felt about those men. Also, since Rusty had begun working on creating his own company, the Celebrity Voicemail Company, he'd worked closely with a business partner as well as several potential investors. So there was a chance that maybe Rusty had just angered the wrong people when talking trash about his former bosses, or maybe he'd had a financial dispute with someone who was working with him on his new business. The detectives kept digging into Rusty and Andrea's computer data, but they also knew they could break everything wide open if they could just locate the silver minivan the shooter had been driving. So, with the help of other police departments in the state, they expanded the search radius for this minivan beyond just the Atlanta metropolitan area. And so soon, police were scouring security camera footage from roads and stores surrounding the city. The detectives also put together a list of people who might have had the motive and the money to hire a hitman to take Rusty out. On November 21st, 2010, so 3 days after Rusty's murder, sheets hung over the mirrors in Rusty and Andrea's house, and friends and family sat together on low stools in the front room. Rusty's funeral had taken place earlier that day, and now the people who had been closest to him were sitting Shiva. Shiva is a Jewish tradition in which family and friends gather together to mourn a dead loved one. They'll say prayers and often receive condolence calls from others. At the house, Andrea thanked her boss, Hemi, and her GE coworkers for coming. They had all been so worried about her when she got that call saying something was wrong at her son's preschool, but none of them could have imagined that that call would eventually lead to this. A little while later, Andrea's boss, Hemi, began to lead the whole group in a prayer. Over 100 members of Hemi's extended family had actually died in the Holocaust, and so that had always inspired him to remain an active member of the Jewish community and to provide any help he could to those close to him, like Andrea. But while Andrea was sitting Shiva and listening to Hemi give this prayer, Detective Thompson and Cordellino just could not shake the feeling that Andrea had to be somehow involved in her husband's death. The police were still desperately trying to find the shooter's silver minivan, but their potential hired hitman theory had also led them to delve into Rusty's finances. And they had discovered that Andrea stood to get a $2 million payout from Rusty's life insurance policy. So along with being the murder victim's spouse, which by default made them a huge potential suspect, Andrea also had a clear financial motive to want her husband dead. And on top of that, she really had not seemed like she wanted to cooperate with police. And so the detectives decided they had to speak to Andrea again, but this time they wanted to isolate her from the rest of her family. On November 24th, almost a week after the murder, Thompson and Cordellino sat down with Andrea in an interview room at the police station. Andrea tucked her brown hair behind her ear, adjusted her glasses, and stared across a small white table at the two detectives. Thompson and Cordellino could tell Andrea was all business, and that she still clearly resented having to speak with the police. But they still started by thanking her for coming in, and then they asked her how her relationship had been with her husband prior to his murder. Andrea admitted things had gotten a bit strained between them when Rusty lost his job, but she said they'd worked through that. And other than typical husband and wife arguments, they actually got along really well. Andrea seemed totally matter-of-fact when she answered these questions. On the one hand, the detectives thought that made her seem almost unfeeling about her husband's death, like she didn't care. But Cordellino realized that this was a woman dealing with an impossible situation. Also, she was used to being in high-powered business meetings, so maybe this was just the way she conducted herself. Then, at some point, Cordellino asked Andrea if it was possible that Rusty could have been having an affair. Was there a jealous lover out there who might have had it out for him? But Andrea didn't flinch. She sort of half smiled and said the idea that Rusty was cheating on her was absurd. He was one of the most loving, supportive people she had ever met. He would never, ever do something like that to their family. So the detectives moved from Andrea and Rusty's personal relationship to their financial situation. But nothing Andrea said indicated that she would have killed Rusty for his life insurance policy. Rusty had put a lot of money away during his time working, and she got paid well at GE, so really, money was not an issue for them. So eventually, the detectives wrapped up the interview and thanked Andrea for her time. But after she left, Thompson and Cordellino felt like they didn't know much more than they did before she showed up. And for the life of them, they could not decide if that was because Andrea really just didn't know anyone who would want to hurt her husband, or if she was hiding something. In the weeks following that interview, no new leads came in, and Thompson and Cordellino began to get frustrated. They still didn't know if the man with the earmuffs and the mustache that Rusty had seen at the house was also the bearded shooter, or if those were two totally different people. And the detectives didn't know if this full bearded shooter had been hired by somebody else, or if it was someone who knew Rusty, that they had somehow overlooked that maybe had a specific reason to attack Rusty. But then, in mid-December, so about a month after Rusty's murder, Detective Thompson was sitting at his desk when one of his team members rushed over to him. And this young cop had a huge smile on his face. Thompson asked him what was going on, and the young cop said he'd been re-watching surveillance footage of the silver minivan as it drove down a street near the preschool. There still was not a clear shot of the license plate, but the young cop had spotted a small white sticker on the van's windshield that nobody had caught before. And he was sure that that was the type of sticker that rental car companies used to track their vehicles. Immediately, Detective Thompson stood up, full of energy. The young cop said, the sticker didn't point to a specific rental car company, but Thompson just put his hand up and said, "Nope, that doesn't matter. This is a huge discovery." Armed with this new information about this sticker, police reached out to and visited rental car companies all across the area. And after about a week or so of searching, they finally found a silver Kia Sedona minivan at a rental car lot 25 miles north of Dunwoody. And that van could absolutely match the shooter's vehicle. And when they checked that minivan's recent rental history, Thompson and Cordellino immediately recognized the name that came up. And they were sure right then and there they had found Rusty's killer. Based on information from the rental car company, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted during the investigation, this is what police think happened to Rusty Snyderman on the morning of November 18th, 2010. On that day, at about 5:45 a.m., the killer heard the voice of the angel ringing in his head. That voice, that sounded just like Olivia Newton-John, had told the killer that time was running out. People were in danger, and the killer had their marching orders. This mission had to be accomplished now. The killer climbed into a silver minivan and then pulled out into the dark, empty early morning streets. The killer drove slowly, moving from dark to light as the van passed under each street lamp. Finally, they pulled the van onto Rusty and Andrea's street about an hour before the sun would rise. They parked their car a few houses down from Rusty's, and then they waited. But soon, the killer noticed lights turning on in some of the houses as people got ready for work and school and their morning routine. So the killer drove the van out of the neighborhood and found a spot on the street not too far from Rusty's son's preschool. The killer sat in the van, occasionally hearing the sound of the angel's voice encouraging them. And then at some point, the killer leaned over, opened up the glove box, and pulled out a semi-automatic pistol. They checked to make sure the gun was loaded, and when they saw it was, the killer laid down on the passenger seat. As the sun rose, the killer continued to just lay there, breathing very slowly in and out, very rhythmically, to ensure they remained calm. Then finally, around 9 a.m., the killer sat up and saw Rusty's Infiniti driving down the street towards them. The killer let Rusty drive by, and then quickly pulled out of their parking space, and then slowly tailed Rusty all the way to the preschool parking lot, and once they got there, the killer parked a few spaces away from Rusty's car. The killer watched as Rusty led his son into the preschool and began chatting with some parents inside of the doorway. As Rusty did this, the killer grabbed the gun off the passenger seat and held it in their lap. Then, a few minutes later, the killer saw Rusty walking back towards his car. At this point, the killer opened up the minivan door and, calm as can be, walked across the parking lot. Rusty had managed to open up his car door, but by that point, the killer was practically on top of him. The killer got within 3 feet of Rusty, raised their gun, and fired. The bullet struck Rusty on the left side of the jaw, traveling through his right shoulder and then lodged in his back. Rusty immediately collapsed to the ground, blood pouring out of his face and seeping through his shirt. The killer turned to walk back to the minivan, but then quickly wheeled back around and fired 3 more shots into Rusty's abdomen as he lay dying on the asphalt. After that, the killer turned and walked back to the minivan, got in, threw it in reverse, peeled out of the parking space, and then sped out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, the killer could see people running over to Rusty on the ground, but the killer felt confident they had killed Rusty and that the angel and demon would now be satisfied. A few minutes later, the killer pulled the van out onto a highway and disappeared into traffic. They drove for a while, exited off the highway, and then headed into a town 25 miles away from Dunwoody. There, they drove the van to the rental car company where they had gotten it, and they pulled it into the return lot. They checked the rearview mirror and looked out the windows. Nobody was nearby, so the killer reached up and yanked the brown wig off their head and also peeled the big fake beard off their face. The killer then stuffed the disguise pieces into a bag, got out of their rental car, and walked to a nearby auto repair shop where they had dropped off their real car for a minor repair the day before. The killer quickly paid for the work on their car and then drove off, headed towards General Electric's Atlanta offices. Some members of the investigative team had remained convinced that Rusty's wife Andrea had killed Rusty, but it turned out the shooter was somebody else who worked at GE. Andrea's boss, Hemi Newman. Police had talked to Hemi when they interviewed Andrea's friends and coworkers, but they didn't really focus on him as a potential suspect until they discovered the minivan at the rental car company. Hemi had used his real name to rent that car, and seeing Hemi's name on the rental form led Thompson and Cordellino back to Andrea's computer. And it turned out that she and Hemi had exchanged a number of emails that led police to believe their relationship was far more than just boss and employee. After police traced the rental van to Hemi, they interviewed and then arrested him. But they continued to push Andrea because they believed she and Hemi had worked together to kill Rusty, 2 lovers who wanted to be rid of Andrea's husband. That's when things got really weird. Hemi admitted to being in love with Andrea, and he even suggested that they had had an affair, though Andrea denied it. Still, Hemi said he did not arrange Rusty's murder with Andrea. Instead, he was simply following orders passed down to him from a demon and an angel who happened to sound like popular singers from the 1970s and 1980s. Talking to a psychiatrist, Hemi admitted that the Barry White-sounding demon had been visiting him for decades, dating back to when he was in college. But it was not until that angel appeared to him in the car on the night he had gone to Rusty and Andrea's house, and Rusty had talked about this new idea that he was going to make this company around celebrity voicemails, that Hemi understood his role in the cosmic battle of good versus evil. According to Hemi, the angel told him that Rusty was a threat to Andrea and the kids. In fact, the angel said Hemi was the true father of Andrea's son and daughter. And apparently, Rusty had found this out, this is again according to the angel, and so Rusty was bound to eventually murder his wife and kids as a result. That is, unless Hemi stopped Rusty by killing him first. To carry out this mission, Hemi first bought a big fake black mustache and slapped it on his face along with some earmuffs, and he spied on Rusty at his house. But of course, Rusty caught him laying on the front yard, but Rusty had no idea it was actually Hemi because the disguise worked. And then after that, when Hemi learned Rusty's routine, he bought a different disguise, the wig and the big fake beard, for the day of the murder. In court, Hemi's defense team entered an insanity plea and then proceeded to trace Hemi's complete and disturbed history with this demon and angel. But the prosecution never bought any of this. They remained convinced that Hemi had concocted this whole story to avoid life in prison. They also believed that Andrea Snyderman, not some angel or demon, was the one who actually put Hemi up to murdering her husband. The jury found Hemi guilty of murder, but they also deemed him mentally ill. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and as of 2024, he is incarcerated at the Augusta State Medical Prison. But after Hemi's conviction, police and the DA stayed focused on Andrea. She was eventually arrested and charged with murder, along with multiple other counts. But the murder charge was dropped, and she was never tried in connection to her husband's death. However, Andrea was found guilty on multiple counts that pertained to hindering the murder investigation. Andrea would go on to serve just 22 months of a 5-year prison sentence, and when she got out of prison, she received the $2 million from Rusty's life insurance policy and maintained custody of her 2 kids.
On the night of January 31st, 1910, an American couple living in London, named Belle and Dr. Harvey Crippen, were hosting a small dinner party for 2 of their friends. The group had just finished their food, and they were now in the middle of a game called Whist, which is a card game, when suddenly Belle put her cards down, and she stood up to tell a story. And Dr. Crippen saw his wife doing this and kind of knew what was going to happen, and he kind of gestured for her to not tell the story and please sit down and play this game, but she just kind of waved at him dismissively, like, please, leave me alone, I'm going to do what I want to do. Dr. Crippen sighed and just kind of sat back and let this happen. Anywhere they went, he knew his wife had to be the center of attention, and there was just nothing he could do. Dr. Crippen was a pretty passive guy who kind of got walked all over, especially by his wife. He was kind of little, he had big bulging eyes and huge glasses he wore, and his job was he basically sat inside of a dentist's office and mixed medicines for the dentist. And so he was just kind of like this anonymous, forgotten about guy that worked in a back office hidden from the world. Meanwhile, his wife, Belle, is like this beautiful woman, huge personality. She's an aspiring actress and singer, and everywhere they went, everybody loved her and basically didn't notice Dr. Crippen. Also, Belle would basically spend all of Dr. Crippen's money on her very expensive wardrobe. And so Dr. Crippen is just so annoyed. He's sitting on the couch and he's watching as Belle has now stood up in her big flowing pink evening dress, and she's regaling the guests with this big story of hers. And at some point, she just kind of transitions from telling the story to performing this bizarre song and dance routine that was the story. It's like she came up with a play in real time and performed it for the guests. And the dinner guests who were watching this performance, their names were Paul and Clara, they were totally entranced by what Belle was doing. They thought it was incredible. Paul and Clara were both theater people like Belle was. Paul was a former comedian, and Clara worked with Belle at their charity, which was called the Music Hall Ladies Guild. And so Dr. Crippen just kind of scowled as the 2 dinner guests applauded really loudly for Belle's big performance. And Belle, she smiled and kind of giggled and then sat down and said, thank you so much. And then, Dr. Crippen, he's thinking, okay, now that she's done with this performance, we can finally play the card game that I really want to play. But Dr. Crippen, after grabbing his cards, looked around and could tell that they were not going to play cards. The big performance by his wife had eaten up all the rest of their time, and now it was too late and the guests had to leave. Before Dr. Crippen could even stand up to begin picking up in the room to get ready for this visit to end, Belle, his wife, was demanding he go outside and get their guests a horse and carriage to bring them back home. And so Dr. Crippen just kind of put his head down and said, okay. And as he was walking towards the front door to get the horse and carriage, Bell yelled after him, and don't get one of those cheap ones. Get an expensive one, a nice one. Dr. Crippen just kind of rolled his eyes, but said, okay, and then he walked outside. But despite looking all over the place, there were no nice horse and carriages. It was just the kind of loud, rickety, bad ones that his wife did not want him to get. But after looking all over the place for a full hour and not finding a nice one, Dr. Crippen finally just had to hail one of the bad horse and carriages. He called them over, and then he went back inside, and he told the guests, okay, I got your horse and carriage. And so they came outside, and so did Belle. And Belle's looking at this carriage after this long delay, and it's this terrible carriage, and she just stares at Dr. Crippen furious. The guests don't seem to mind. They just walk down the stairs, they get in their carriage, they say goodbye, and they take off. But the second Dr. Crippen had turned back around, Belle was already back inside their home. And so he knows, as soon as he goes in there, he's going to get yelled at. And so he went inside the home, and in the living room was Belle, arms folded, just staring at him, absolutely furious. And she began laying into him about not only how ridiculous it was that it took him a whole hour to find the carriage, and it was a terrible carriage, something she said not to do, and she told him that he was the reason their whole dinner party had been a total disaster. Even though Dr. Crippen was like, I think it went pretty well. But in Belle's mind, her husband was the reason this party had totally failed. He was boring. He didn't contribute anything. And she told him that she caught that he did not applaud nearly as loudly as Paul and Clara had for her big performance. And that really hurt her feelings. When Dr. Crippen just didn't say anything, he just kind of knew to keep his head down and let his wife talk. When that happened, Belle got so frustrated, she kind of huffed and then turned around and walked over to the mantelpiece, and she took this framed photo that she shamelessly left up in their house that was of her former lover who she openly had had an affair with. It was this beautifully handsome, square-jawed prizefighter who, again, Dr. Crippen knew his wife had cheated on him with. And so Belle, she takes this photo and she holds it up and she points right at him and she looks at her husband and says, I can get any man I want. Look right here. I can get him if I want to. I don't need you. But Dr. Crippen was not affected by this. He was completely used to being treated this way by Belle. And so again, he just stayed silent and took what she was throwing at him. And so again, Belle gets even more frustrated because she's not getting a reaction from Dr. Crippen. She finally just goes, you know what? I'm going to leave you tomorrow. I'm done with you. I can't be with you. It's over. And again, Dr. Crippen just didn't react. I mean, this really was typical behavior for his wife, even this threat of leaving him tomorrow. She had done this before, but never followed through on it. It was just kind of like Dr. Crippen was her punching bag, basically 24/7. And so for now, all Dr. Crippen really wanted was for his wife to just stop ranting and raving so he could just go to bed. He didn't really care what she was saying. Frankly, he wouldn't even care if she did leave him the next day. He was totally unhappy in this marriage, as obviously she was, but he was so scared of scandal, he couldn't bring himself to divorce his wife. But if she actually followed through and left him, he'd be free. The marriage would be over and it would be her fault. And so Dr. Crippen just stood there waiting for his wife to finish, but it was clear she had a lot to say. Even after threatening to leave him, she just kept on laying into him about all his faults. And then at some point, Dr. Crippen just totally caught her off guard by interjecting and saying, hey, Belle, do you want some whiskey? And Belle just kind of stopped and stared at her husband inquisitively. And then it was like her whole mood changed. And she was like, actually, yeah, I'll take some whiskey. And so Dr. Crippen said, great, I'll go make it. And he walked over to the liquor cabinet and he poured both of them a drink. Two days later, the members of the charity that Belle and Clara, the dinner guest, were a part of, the Music Hall Ladies Guild, they were all sitting in their office in London waiting to start their meeting. But there was a problem. Belle, who was their treasurer and therefore needed to be at this meeting, was not at this meeting. She was late and nobody knew where she was. And so after they sat in this office for a while, just waiting, they finally heard a knock on the door. And so one of the women got up, they opened up the door, and standing outside is Dr. Crippen's assistant, this young woman named Ethel, and she looked kind of frazzled and maybe a little bit out of breath. and she was carrying a letter and a package in her hands. And so Ethel would tell the woman who opened the door that she was here on behalf of Dr. Crippen and also Belle. And so the woman who opened the door said, okay, come on in. And so Ethel walked into the office and she placed the letter and the package on the table, and then she quickly turned around and left. After she was gone, the guild members kind of looked at each other confused and then just reached out and they grabbed the letter, they opened it up and they read it. And the letter was written by Dr. Crippen, and he was telling the members of this guild that unfortunately one of Belle's family members back in America had fallen ill, and so Belle had to go back to America and take care of this person, and she'd be gone for at least several months. And then when they opened up the package that Ethel had dropped off, that contained the guild's checkbook and also their ledger. That way they'd be able to go out and find a new treasurer to replace Belle. And so when they had finished reading this letter and seeing the contents of this package, the members of this guild just kind of looked at each other, not really sure what to do. You know, it seemed odd that Belle had not told them she was doing this, that she had left without saying goodbye. But at the same time, it seemed like whatever she was dealing with in America was very serious. And so they decided the only thing they could do was to just hire a temporary treasurer and wait for Belle to come back. About 3 weeks later, Clara and the rest of the Ladies' Guild members hosted their annual ball. And like always, they invited Belle as well as her husband, Dr. Crippen, even though they knew, this invitation was kind of a formality because Belle was still in America. But Dr. Crippen would show up to this ball, and he would not show up alone. And it caused a bit of an outrage. On Dr. Crippen's arm was very obviously his date. Ethel, his assistant, the young woman who had dropped off that letter and the package to the members of the guild about Belle's sudden departure. Clara stared incredulously at Dr. Crippen and Ethel as they kind of swayed around the room dancing. I mean, Clara just could not understand what was going through Dr. Crippen's head. How could he possibly think it was appropriate to so openly cheat on his wife around all of his wife's friends and in such a public place? It just seemed unfathomable that anybody would do what Dr. Crippen was doing. And so that night, Clara and the other members of the Ladies' Guild, they got together and they decided that, because of Dr. Crippen's obvious infidelity, they could not invite him to be a part of anything to do with the Ladies' Guild, at least not until they talked to Belle again when she got back. But Belle didn't come back. And she never wrote to any of the members of the guild or any of her friends. She just disappeared. And on March 20th, 1910, so roughly 2 months after Belle supposedly fled to America, Dr. Crippen came out and said he had just gotten some terrible news. It would turn out his wife, Belle, had fallen ill while in America, and she had died. When Clara and the rest of the Ladies' Guild members heard about this, their disgust at Dr. Crippen's cheating quickly turned into suspicion that maybe he had something to do with Belle's early demise. He played a role in her disappearance. He had to. So one of the members of this guild went to the police and reported Belle missing. However, at first, the police were not inclined to pursue this case, because from their perspective, there was no evidence of a crime committed here. All they knew was this woman, Belle, had died in America, supposedly from natural causes, and so the only thing that was contrary to that were Belle's friends who basically were saying, well, maybe she was murdered by her husband because her husband was cheating on her. And the police were like, that doesn't line up. Just because he was cheating on her does not mean he killed her. But Belle's friends continued to keep the pressure on police. And finally, after 3 months, the police would assign a detective. His name was Walter Dew, and Inspector Dew had been a detective for more than 20 years, and he had even worked on the very famous serial killer case, Jack the Ripper, and had been one of the people who actually found the last body, although the Jack the Ripper case had gone unsolved. But coming out of that investigation, Walter Dew had really developed a great reputation as a really good detective. And so to have him lead this case was a big deal. And so on the afternoon of July 6th, 1910, so roughly 5 months after Bell had gone missing, Inspector Dew, as one of his first things he would do for this case, went to Dr. Crippen's house to ask him about his wife. Now, Inspector Dew expected that Dr. Crippen would tell him the same story he had told everybody else about Belle, which is, she had to go to America to take care of this sick relative, and while she was over there, unfortunately, Belle passed away. But what Dr. Crippen ultimately told Inspector Dew was not that. Now, at first, Inspector Dew just asked Dr. Crippen a lot of basic questions about his wife. But Dr. Crippen seemed really awkward as he answered these questions. He actually almost seemed really embarrassed. And Inspector Dew clearly noticed this, but just kept on asking these routine questions and just allowed Dr. Crippen to act however he was going to act. But at some point, Dr. Crippen just stopped answering the questions altogether, and he paused for a minute with his head in his hands, and then he took off his glasses, he put them on the table, and then he looked up at Inspector Dew, and he said, I should just tell you the truth. Belle isn't dead. Dr. Crippen told the inspector that the day following that dinner party they hosted with Paul and Clara, that morning when Dr. Crippen woke up, his wife was gone, and all her things were gone too. She had packed up in the middle of the night and left without telling him where she was going. And so Dr. Crippen realized his wife had finally made good on the threat to leave him. Dr. Crippen said he lied about what happened to Belle because he was trying to avoid a scandal. He said that, while Belle was horrible to him personally and really mistreated him, she was really kind of amazing with everybody else, and everybody else loved her. And so Dr. Crippen really believed that lying about this would ultimately save her reputation and his own. So it was a win-win. And once Dr. Crippen was relatively sure Belle was not going to be coming back, that she really had left him for good, that was when he began openly dating Ethel, because he had actually been in love with his assistant Ethel for a long time, and he felt like now, with his wife out of the picture, he could finally love her out in the open, even though he admitted, nobody would actually understand the dynamic here, because everybody else thinks Belle is over in America, and here I am cheating on her. But, Dr. Crippen insisted to the inspector that this was the truth. He was not cheating on Belle. He didn't have anything to do with her disappearance. She left of her own accord, and here he was. And so after Dr. Crippen explained all this to the inspector, Dr. Crippen just put his face in his hands and just looked so ashamed and embarrassed, to the point where Inspector Dew really believed Dr. Crippen. I mean, this is a guy who has just poured his soul out about some of the most embarrassing things of his entire life, so he's got to be telling the truth. Also, Inspector Dew couldn't help but think to himself that Dr. Crippen was this little kind of passive-seeming guy who did not really seem capable of killing somebody else. But at the same time, Inspector Dew could definitely see a woman like Belle leaving Dr. Crippen the way that she did. Still, just to be thorough, Inspector Dew asked Dr. Crippen if he wouldn't mind allowing the inspector to search the property, because after all, this is a missing person case, and so we gotta check everything. Dr. Crippen said, absolutely, search my house, do whatever you gotta do, and Inspector Dew would do just that. He went all over the house, looked everywhere, and he would find nothing. So the inspector told Dr. Crippen that as of now, he believed his story and that basically the case was closed. But Inspector Dew really needed to talk to Belle in order to officially close the case, because right now, everybody thought she was dead, no one had heard from her, and so that was the one missing piece. And so Dr. Crippen said that was totally fine, and he and the inspector actually worked together to draft up this little advertisement that would go in newspapers in America that basically would say, hey, Belle, if you see this, you need to contact police in London because we're looking for you. And so after the two men had come up with the language they wanted for this advertisement, Inspector Dew thanked Dr. Crippen, said he'd be in touch, and then he left. But 5 days later, when Inspector Dew went to follow up with Dr. Crippen, he discovered that Dr. Crippen and his new lover, Ethel, his assistant, were both gone, and nobody knew where they were. And this changed everything about the Belle case. Inspector Dew couldn't help but think Dr. Crippen and Ethel look like they're running from something. So probably they lied to me about their involvement with Belle's disappearance. And so Inspector Dew sent physical descriptions to all the newspapers and police stations all across Europe. And also he made a note to check all the ships that were bound for America in case Dr. Crippen and Ethel had decided to flee Europe that way. And while this big manhunt was just getting underway, Inspector Dew and his team went back to Dr. Crippen's house to do a much more thorough search. So police descended on Dr. Crippen's beautiful 3-story home on a quiet street, and they went inside and they tore apart everything. They flipped over mattresses, they opened up drawers and closets, they threw everything out, but they found nothing suspicious. But at some point, Inspector Dew, who was feeling really annoyed that he'd been totally duped by this doctor, he was walking down the basement steps in Dr. Crippen's house, and as he went down, he saw there were other investigators already in the basement conducting yet another fruitless search. But as Inspector Dew kind of turned the corner at the base of the basement stairs, he noticed the bricks that were laying in front of the fireplace that was in the basement just looked a little bit off, like they were maybe too new or something. And so just kind of acting on a hunch, he walked over to these bricks that were laid out right in front of this fireplace, and he's looking at them, and he grabs a poker, one of the pokers you use to move the logs around in a fire, and he just began tapping on each of the individual bricks right in front of them. And with every tap, he would hear the solid thump sound that you're hitting something hard that is beneath this brick. But as he went along hitting each of these bricks, he eventually reached the kind of center of these bricks, and when he brought that poker down on one of those bricks, it made a hollow sound. Clearly, there was something underneath these bricks. And so Inspector Dew is super excited. He calls for his team to come over, and one by one, they begin pulling up all these bricks, and after they're all gone, they see there's this perfectly smooth layer of clay that these bricks were sitting on top of. And so Inspector Dew called for a shovel, a guy brought one over, and Dew, he took one scoop with the shovel, and immediately this horrible smell began coming out of the ground that was so gross that the guys around Inspector Dew began retching and vomiting, and before long, the entire group of investigators had basically fled the basement to get away from this horrible smell. But after composing themselves, Inspector Dew and the rest of his team put handkerchiefs over their nose and their mouths, and they went back into the house, down into the basement, they grabbed that shovel, and they continued to dig, and after just a couple of scoops, they saw what was causing this terrible smell. In this clay pit, this hole in the basement underneath the bricks, were all these human body parts in the ground. But there were no arms, there were no legs, there was no head. All you had were just the internal organs of somebody, and then also there was like a blanket of skin that looked like it had been extracted from somebody's body with near surgical precision. Now, the police could not, based on these limited remains, make an actual positive identification of who exactly this was, but they did find in this pit, along with the organs and the skin, were several strands of hair that matched Belle's. There were several pieces of pajamas that belonged to Dr. Crippen, and then also on that skin fillet they found, there was a distinctive birthmark on it that matched the one that Belle had. Also, investigators were able to determine that inside of the intestines that were found in this hole were traces of a particular kind of tranquilizer that in the weeks leading up to Belle's disappearance, Dr. Crippen was making that particular tranquilizer at his work. He mixed medicines for dentist offices. That was the tranquilizer he was working with right before Belle disappeared. Shortly after these shocking discoveries were made, Dr. Crippen and Ethel were found on a boat, trying to flee the country that way, and so they would be arrested, and so ultimately Dr. Crippen would be found guilty of murdering his wife, and he would be sentenced to death. As for Ethel, she would be acquitted of any participation in the crime. However, this was not the end of the story. Far from it. 100 years later, in 2010, a forensic scientist from Michigan State University fished out a piece of tissue from the remains found in Dr. Crippen's basement that had been preserved inside of a London museum. Now, this murder case had been officially closed since 1910, but the bizarre details of this case had never really fully made sense to a lot of people. Like, they didn't understand how or why Dr. Crippen had successfully disposed of his wife's head, her arms, her legs, all her bones. Those are all gone. Nobody ever found those. But he decided to keep her organs and her skin buried in his basement under loose bricks. That doesn't make any sense. Also, if Dr. Crippen killed his wife by poisoning her, which is what is suggested from all that tranquilizer that was found in her intestines, that basically he overdosed her, then why did he dismember her afterwards? The reason killers often kill with poison is because it makes the victim's death look a bit more natural. Whereas if you mutilate someone's body, then obviously someone did it and you're calling suspicion on yourself. And so, did Dr. Crippen poison his wife and then just throw that out the window and mutilated her body anyways? It just didn't make sense. So, this forensic scientist from Michigan State University decided he was finally going to get some answers to this case. And so what he did is he compared the DNA from the tissue he dug out to the DNA of one of Bell's grand nieces. And when he compared the two, he saw they didn't match. Which meant the body that was found in Dr. Crippen's basement was not Bell's. But that wasn't even the weirdest part. It was determined following this test by this forensic scientist that the body in Dr. Crippen's basement wasn't even female. It was a male. But to this day, no one has ever been able to identify who that body was, and Bell was never found. All we know is an innocent man, Dr. Crippen, was put to death for something he didn't do.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.
On a sunny afternoon in October of 2015, a 39-year-old man named Richard Jones walked along the perimeter of the yard inside of the state prison in Kansas, where Richard was serving time for a robbery. Up ahead, Richard could see there was a small basketball court with one hoop on it, and on the blacktop were dozens of other inmates that were exercising and chatting and socializing, and Richard actually knew most of them because he had been in prison for 16 years now, and Richard was also a very likable guy who was very outgoing and personable, and so he made friends really easily, even in prison. And so as Richard continued his walk in the direction of the basketball court, he saw one of the guys on the blacktop broke free from the group and began moving towards Richard. And Richard immediately recognized who it was. It was his good friend, Steve. And Richard was about to give him a friendly wave when he noticed Steve looked really mad. And so Richard actually just stopped and stared at Steve as he slowly approached him, and as he got closer, Richard could see Steve's fists were balled up and his face was in a scowl. I mean, Steve looked like he was coming over to fight Richard. And so when Steve got about 10 feet away from Richard, Richard actually spoke up before Steve could say anything, and he said, "Steve, what's going on? Why are you so upset?" Steve was kind of a hothead, and Richard knew that, but a lot of times, even when he got mad about things, it would blow over really quickly. And so this was kind of routine, but Richard just couldn't think of a reason for why Steve would be mad at him. And so Steve walks right up to Richard and he goes, "Oh, so now you want to talk to me?" Richard was immediately confused and kind of turned his head sideways and was like, "What?" Steve stared at Richard, kind of expecting Richard to eventually apologize or something, but eventually he noticed that Richard really was not sure what he was talking about. And so Steve was like, "This morning, I went up to you at the cafeteria line, I tried to talk to you, and you completely blew me off and walked away in front of a big group of people. That really embarrassed me and made me look bad." And Richard was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't even see you this morning. I don't know where this is coming from." Steve was not buying it, and he was like, "Richard, I know it was you. I saw you this morning. I spoke to you this morning. You did that." And Richard was like, "No, really, Steve, I'm sorry. I have no idea what this is about." And so these two continued to go back and forth on this. And then at some point, they both kind of noticed that they were drawing lots of attention because they are in prison and any sort of confrontation immediately draws eyeballs. And so when they noticed other inmates were kind of beginning to walk over to see what was going on and the guards were starting to notice, Steve just said, "You know what, Richard, fine. I guess I must have made a mistake. No big deal." And he turned and he ran back to the basketball court. After Steve had left, Richard continued his walk around the perimeter, but that exchange with Steve had really weirded him out because this was actually not the first time something like this had happened. It all started a month ago when an inmate that Richard didn't know came up to him like he definitely knew him and said to Richard, "Hey, how's your grandmother? I heard she fell down. Is she okay?" And at first, Richard was like, "Wait a minute, is my grandmother okay? Did she fall?" But then Richard eventually realized that this inmate thought Richard was someone that he wasn't. Now, at first, Richard thought this was just kind of like a weird one-off event, but every few days after this first time, something else would happen. Either an inmate who Richard didn't know would come up to him and be really friendly with him, as if they knew Richard, but Richard clearly didn't know them, or someone Richard did know would come up to him and accuse him of odd behavior that Richard couldn't remember doing. Like the interaction he had with Steve when Steve came up and said, "You snubbed me in the lunch line." And so after Richard's interaction with Steve, Richard began to think, wait a minute, is someone screwing with me? Is that what's been going on? The next morning during breakfast, Richard decided not to sit where he normally did, and instead he sat on the very far side in the corner of the cafeteria to basically just be able to people watch all the people inside the cafeteria. And then that afternoon, when Richard was outside, instead of walking around the perimeter like he liked to do, he just sat in a central location and just constantly scanned the whole yard. Now, Richard didn't really know what he was actually looking for. He just figured, maybe I'll see something suspicious, I'll see someone staring at me for too long, or I'll see someone I don't know talking to my friends. Something will tip me off to what's been going on for the past couple of weeks. But despite all this careful people watching he was doing, Richard didn't see anything suspicious. Until 1 week after the interaction Richard had with Steve about snubbing him in the lunch line, Richard was sitting in the cafeteria again when he noticed something very strange on the other side of the cafeteria. And when he saw it, he just stood up and stared, and he felt his heart starting to race faster, and he felt his breath speeding up. And Steve actually was sitting next to him and said, "Hey, Richard, what's going on?" And Richard couldn't even find the words. He just raised his arm up and pointed to the other side of the room. When Richard had originally been arrested 16 years earlier, it was for robbing someone in a Walmart parking lot. Richard had always claimed he did not do it, but multiple witnesses had pulled Richard out of a lineup saying that's the guy. And the woman who actually got robbed told police she overheard the getaway driver yelling to Rick, the man who had robbed her, to get in the car so they could leave. And Rick is a nickname for Richard. Richard had insisted he was at a barbecue in another state at the time of this robbery, and so it really couldn't have been him, but the evidence was just overwhelming, and so eventually he was convicted. Richard had never been able to understand why so many people 16 years earlier had insisted that he was the one who committed that crime. And more recently, he couldn't understand why his friends, like Steve, were accusing him of doing things that he didn't remember doing. But that night in the jail cafeteria, when Richard spotted something on the other side of the room, suddenly everything over the last 16 years made perfect sense. Richard really was an innocent man. He did not rob that woman in the Walmart parking lot. His doppelganger had. A doppelganger is someone who looks exactly like you, but they're not actually related to you. It's just genetic chance that somebody else on the planet looks just like you. And it just so happened that Richard's doppelganger, who was this man named Ricky Amos, so it just so happened as well that the doppelganger shared basically the same first name, Ricky and Richard. Well, this doppelganger, Ricky, just happened to be sent to the same prison that Richard was at for a totally unrelated crime. These two men have never met, there's no connection whatsoever, they just look the same. And when Richard looked across the cafeteria and saw Ricky, it was like looking at a clone of himself, and it all clicked. All the people that were coming up to him saying, "You were doing this and acting weird," Well, those people, Stephen included, were actually interacting with his doppelganger, Ricky. And 16 years earlier, Ricky was the one who committed that robbery in Walmart, and the victim and the witnesses, they all confused Ricky for Richard. Once a judge was made aware of this situation and saw the two photos side by side, he knew the police had made a mistake. Even the prosecutor who had tried Richard in the robbery case supported his release. Richard was freed in 2017 and got a $1 million settlement from the state. As for the doppelganger, Ricky Amos, he was never actually tried for the robbery 16 years earlier because by the time they figured out he was the robber, the case was too old to try.
Our next story is called Lucky Shot.
There is a very popular TV show on HBO called Curb Your Enthusiasm, and it's about the mega famous Larry David who created Seinfeld. And so Curb Your Enthusiasm is totally a satire. It's a comedy, it's about Larry David. And in fact, Larry David plays himself in the show, but Larry David in the show is a very exaggerated version of himself in real life. But the show is shot to look like it's almost biographical, but it's not. It's totally comedy. Apparently, in real life, Larry is known for getting into kind of funny, awkward situations, often that he brings on himself. And so on the show, basically every episode, Larry David finds himself getting into totally absurd situations that just get worse and worse and worse because Larry just makes all the wrong decisions. And so it's a really funny show. However, there is one particular episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm that will go down as the single episode virtually everyone who has ever watched the show will remember, and it's not because it was funny. It's because this particular episode had massive ripple effects that nobody from Larry David to writers to producers, anybody involved with this production could have predicted. The episode in question is called The Carpool Lane, and in this episode, Larry David, the character, is late to a baseball game at Dodger Stadium. And so he's stuck in traffic and he's totally upset. And then he has this idea that if he picks up this sex worker who's right outside his car, that if she gets in the car with him, he'll now have 2 passengers in his car and therefore will be eligible to use the carpool lane that currently nobody else was using in this traffic jam. And so that would allow him to get to Dodger Stadium faster. And so he hires this sex worker and she gets in the car and Larry kind of awkwardly explains his plan. And then he hops in the carpool lane. He makes his way to Dodger Stadium. The plan works great. And when he gets there, he actually ends up bringing the sex worker with him into the stadium just to enjoy the game with him. And so he goes up, they find their seats, and their seats are just so bad. But as they're sitting there and Larry's totally upset about how bad his seats are, Larry happens to see one of his friends who's also at this Dodgers game, and Larry can tell, his friend has great seats. And so the rest of the episode is basically Larry going down and trying to convince his friend to give up his seats for Larry and his sex worker to watch the game, and his friend just continuously says no. And so really that's the gist of the episode, and you can see how it kind of gets more and more ridiculous, and it gets really funny, but it's pretty typical writing for this show. This was not like a special show in any way. It was just kind of par for the course, Curb Your Enthusiasm. That is, until a lawyer named Todd Melnick heard about it. In the fall of 2003, this lawyer, Todd Melnick, called HBO and said he needed to see the raw footage from the episode they shot called A Carpool Lane. A producer at HBO named Tim Gibbons is the one who answered this call, and his first reaction was, we can't let you see this footage because this episode hasn't even aired yet, and so you're going to have to wait the couple of months until this episode comes out if you want to see this footage. But Tim quickly noticed that Todd Melnick, the lawyer, was not about to give up this easily. He was adamant that he had to see this footage right now. And so eventually, Tim Gibbons actually would go and find Larry David, and he would ask Larry, hey, do you mind if this random lawyer comes and watches this footage from this unaired episode? And Larry was like, okay. And so the next day, Todd Melnick showed up at HBO, and he was led into this small room with a TV, and Tim, the producer he spoke to, as well as Larry David and a few other people from the Curb Your Enthusiasm production, they all filed into this room, and all of them just sat down, and then they began playing the footage, the raw footage from the Carpool Lane episode. And as they watched this footage, which was hours and hours and hours long, the lawyer, Todd Melnick, is watching the footage and just kind of slumping into his chair, just seeming like what he was watching was making him more and more unhappy. That clearly, he was looking for something and he was not seeing it in this footage. But finally, when one of the producers put in the fifth and final tape of raw footage from this episode, Todd Melnick, as he's sitting there watching the footage, which looks basically like Larry walking up and down the steps at Dodger Stadium over and over again, and him also walking in and out of his aisle, they reshot the scene of him sitting down inside of his crappy seats. Todd's watching this over and over again, and then suddenly he sits up and he points at the screen and goes, "Right there." It would turn out Todd Melnick was investigating a murder case. The murder happened on May 12, 2003. A 16-year-old girl named Martha Puebla was standing in front of her house in a neighborhood in Los Angeles when she was shot by gang members because apparently a rumor had gotten out that Martha was snitching on gang members, and so she was killed. And the police actually had already made an arrest in this murder. They had arrested a guy named Juan Catalan. Juan's brother, Mario, was on trial for a different murder, and just 2 weeks before Martha's murder, Martha testified in Mario's case. And who was in the audience listening to Martha's damning testimony about Mario? Well, Mario's brother, Juan. And so prosecutors believed this was the motive for Juan to kill Martha. Also, there was an eyewitness to Martha's murder, and the sketch artist who worked with this eyewitness came up with a composite sketch of Martha's killer that looked exactly like Juan. And so now Juan was potentially facing the death penalty if he was found guilty. But Juan was adamant that he did not kill Martha, and on the night of her murder, he said he was at the Dodgers game where they were filming a Curb Your Enthusiasm episode. But nobody believed him except for his lawyer, Todd Melnick, who called HBO, got access to all that unseen footage from the episode, and after watching for hours and hours and hours, finally that fifth tape goes in, and sure enough, Todd Melnick watched as his client, Juan Catalan, strolled right into frame and sat down with his daughter. It would turn out Juan was telling the truth the whole time, he did not kill Martha, and Curb Your Enthusiasm proved it. Shortly after this discovery, Juan would be released from prison and he would receive a settlement of $320,000 from the city of Los Angeles and the police. As for Martha, the police were able to eventually track down 4 people who were involved in her murder, and all 4 would be convicted and sent to jail for life.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Familiar Face.
On the morning of February 25th, 2015, in a little house in the city of Cape Town in South Africa, a 17-year-old girl named Misha Solomon was packing up her homework in between bites of her breakfast. And as she did this, her mother, Lavana, walked into the kitchen with a big smile on her face, and she was holding up this beautiful red flowing dress, and immediately Misha knew what it was. Her mom had been making this dress by hand over the past couple of days. It was for a big school dance that was coming up, and she saw that it was now done. And so Misha, she put down her breakfast and her homework, and she rushed over to her mom, and she admired this gorgeous dress, and thanked her mom for all the hard work and said it's absolutely perfect. And then from somewhere behind Misha, her father, who was still sitting at the table, kind of grunted out, "Hey, isn't that dress a little bit revealing?" And Misha and her mom kind of just rolled their eyes because they knew Misha's dad just loved his daughter and was very, very protective of her. And so basically anything she wore that wasn't full coverage was too revealing. And so Misha, after rolling her eyes, walked over to her dad. She gave him a big hug and a kiss, and she said, "Dad, don't worry about it. It's just fine." And so after that, Misha went back to her breakfast, she finished eating, she packed up her stuff, and then she gave her mom and her dad another hug and a kiss and said goodbye, and then she headed out the front door out to the road where her aunt was waiting in her car. As Misha's aunt drove her to school, like she did almost every single morning, Misha began to notice her aunt was acting kind of strange and constantly looking behind her and looking in her rearview mirror. And finally, Misha said to her aunt, what's going on? What are you looking at back there? And Misha's aunt would say, I know this sounds crazy, but I'm pretty sure there's a white car that's following me. And in fact, over the past couple of days, I've seen what I think is this same white car following us anytime I'm driving you to school. And so Misha just turned around in her seat and looked out the back window, and she saw there were dozens of white cars on the road, so it was pretty difficult to tell which one her aunt was talking about. But as she's looking, none of the cars seemed suspicious, and so Misha turned back around and told her aunt, I think you're just being paranoid. Nobody's following us. There's no reason to follow us. A few minutes later, Misha's aunt pulled up alongside the front of the school, and Misha said goodbye to her aunt, she thanked her, she hopped outside, and she rushed into the school. And then Misha made her way up to the hallway where her first class was, and as she was walking down the hallway, her best friend, Cassidy Nurse, was walking up the hallway in her direction. And so right away, Misha sees Cassidy and she waves and smiles and begins walking towards her. But Cassidy gave Misha this kind of weird, lukewarm smile and then quickly looked away from Misha, and then Cassidy turned and bolted into the nearest classroom. And so Misha just came to a stop and just looked at the doorway where her best friend has disappeared, and she starts thinking to herself, what's going on? Why did she do that? That was so cold. And then Misha began to think about the fact that actually, over the past couple of days, Cassidy had been acting really strange. It was like she was trying to avoid Misha, but Misha had no idea why. It wasn't like they were fighting. Normally, Misha and Cassidy were totally inseparable. They had met earlier that school year, and even though they were actually kind of far apart in age, Cassidy was in 8th grade and Misha was in 12th grade, it was like it didn't matter. It was like right away when they met each other, they had this special bond where they just had to be around each other all the time, they shared everything with each other, and certainly anytime they saw each other in the hallway, they would stop to chat or even go into a nearby bathroom and do each other's hair and makeup and share any gossip they had recently heard. So for Cassidy to act like this was just totally uncharacteristic, and it really upset Misha. But just then, the bell rang in the school, so Misha knew at this point she was now late for her class, and so she had to forget about whatever was going on with Cassidy, and Misha just hustled down the hallway and went into her classroom. And so Misha, she takes her seat at her desk, she puts her stuff down, and she's getting ready to listen to the teacher, when suddenly the principal comes in without even knocking, and without even saying anything to Misha's teacher, the principal walks right up to Misha and says, "I need you to come with me." And right away, Misha's classmates, all who saw this, they begin oohing and awing as if Misha is in huge trouble. But Misha's thinking to herself, I didn't do anything. I have no idea what this is about. And so she kind of smiled like it was no big deal. She picked up her stuff and she followed the principal out into the hallway. But as Misha followed the principal down the hallway towards the principal's office, Misha's smile faded and she began to wonder, what is this about? What's going on? And then finally, they got to the principal's office. The principal opened up the door. Misha went in first, and the principal trailed behind her and shut the door behind them. When Misha looked into the principal's office, she saw there were already two people inside who she didn't recognize. It was two women who were very serious looking, who were sitting on the side of the room. And as soon as Misha walked in, the two women, without introducing themselves, just told Misha to come over and take a seat next to them. And Misha, instead of doing that, just paused and looked at the women and said, "What's going on?" And at this, the two women kind of looked at each other, and then one of the women piped up and said, "Misha, we're here because the police sent us. And they sent us because of a photo that you and your very close friend Cassidy took." But before Misha could ask any questions like, what photo are you talking about and really what's going on here, these two women would explain the whole situation to Misha. And basically what they did is they told her this long, very convoluted story that involved Misha, it involved Cassidy, it involved this photo. And by the end of this story, this explainer story, Misha had taken a seat and put her hand over her mouth in utter disbelief. And then when the women were done explaining everything, Misha had a million questions, but it was like she was so overwhelmed with what she was just told that she just continued to sit there with her hand over her mouth, totally silent. And then finally, Misha did break the silence by saying, "Can I please just call my parents?" And at this, the social workers said, "No, you can't. And in fact, the police are already at your parents' house. They're talking to your parents right now. And so you can't talk to them. You can't even go home. In fact, you have to come with us for tonight." And then the two women got up and they made their way out of the principal's office. And they said, "Come on, Misha, you have to come with us." And so Misha stood up and she's totally flabbergasted. She really is like, how is this real life? And the principal at this point walked over and gave Misha a hug. And it was like suddenly the floodgates opened and Misha just began sobbing hysterically. And as she did, the social workers just stood there waiting patiently. And then as soon as it seemed like Misha was done crying, they said, "Come on, you really need to come with us." And so Misha, she let go of the principal and she followed the two women out of the school out to one of their cars. And once they got in the car, the two women explained to Misha that they were going to take her to a safe house for the night. But before they went to the safe house, they would need to make a quick pit stop at a local medical clinic. And so Misha, who at this point is not even asking questions, just said, okay. And so the women, they drove to the medical clinic. They were inside for just a matter of minutes. When they came back out again, they drove the rest of the way to the safe house. And when they got to the safe house, it just looked like a normal house on the outside. But on the inside, when the two women were leading Misha through and showing her where everything was, the kitchen, the bathroom, her bedroom, all Misha saw was all these other kids who were staying there who were orphaned and abandoned. And it started to give Misha a panic attack. And she asked the women again, "Can I please call my parents?" And they said, "No, you really can't." But one of the two social workers could tell that Misha, she's having a breakdown. This is the worst day of her life, very likely. And so one of the two women actually offered to Misha to come home with her and stay at her house instead of the safe house, and Misha agreed. And so that social worker and Misha, they would leave together, they would get into that woman's car, and they would drive to her house. And then the social worker told Misha that unfortunately now it was just a waiting game. They needed to wait for the police to get back in touch with them with more information. That night, as Misha lay in this woman's guest bedroom, looking up at the ceiling, wondering how the heck this had become her life, she began to think about the photo that her and Cassidy had took that had kind of started this whole horrible thing. And so Misha began to think about the day they took this picture, and all she remembered was that she and Cassidy were just kind of goofing around and smiling and making funny faces and just taking photos as they went. She certainly didn't think that one of those pictures they took would totally change her life. The following morning, when Misha woke up, the social worker brought her to their office, the social worker's office, and there they met with the other woman who had first met Misha in the principal's office, and the three of them just sat in the office, not talking much, eating chicken wings and other snacks, just literally waiting for police to call them. And finally, they would call. And when they did, one of the social workers answered the phone, and as she listened to what she was being told, she began to frown, and by the time she hung up, she was crying. The news from the police was the news Misha had been afraid of ever since sitting in the principal's office the day before and hearing this whole crazy story about her and Cassidy and this photo. The special pit stop that Misha and the social workers made at the medical clinic the day before on the way to the safe house was so that Misha could get a DNA test. And now the police were calling back with the results of the test. And what the results showed was Misha Solomon was not actually Misha Solomon. Her real name was Zephany Nurse. 17 years earlier, Zephany Nurse had been stolen out of her crib at the hospital in Cape Town, and despite a massive manhunt for her, she was never found. And so this was a huge, famous case in Cape Town, and most people assumed it would never be solved. But Misha's DNA had done just that. It proved that Misha's parents, who had loved her and raised her since she was a baby, were not actually her parents. Her mother, Lavana, was actually her kidnapper, and now she was under arrest. But even though this revelation was incredibly shocking and upsetting for Misha, it was not nearly as shocking as learning the identity of her real biological parents. The social workers took Misha from their office to the police station, where they told Misha her real biological parents were waiting to meet her. And so once they went inside the police station, Misha gripped onto the social worker's arm tightly. She was incredibly nervous, and she was led down a hallway to a door that was shut. And then finally, when Misha was ready, she pushed the door open, and her real parents, who were sitting right in front of her, they stood up and they ran towards her crying. But Misha just stood there, stunned and silent, staring at them. Because these people, they were not strangers to her. She knew them extremely well. They were the parents of her best friend in the world, Cassidy Nurse. Which meant Misha, aka Zephany Nurse, was Cassidy's sister. Months earlier, when Misha and Cassidy first met each other, the reason they hit it off so quickly, and the reason they had similar senses of humor and liked the same things, and looked so dramatically similar, is because they were literally sisters. They just didn't know it. And then one day, they took a series of selfie photos of themselves, and Cassidy, she would go home and show one of those photos to her parents and say, hey, look, my best friend, Misha Solomon, look how similar we look. And when Cassidy's parents looked at Misha Solomon, they instinctively knew, that is our daughter. That is Zephany Nurse. And so they would bring this photo to the police, and the police would begin to investigate. And during this investigation, they began trailing Misha. So when Misha's aunt told Misha that she thought a white car was following her, she wasn't just being paranoid. Those were investigators following Misha around, trying to get a feel for her schedule, because they needed to approach her when she was alone in order to get a DNA sample. They were worried if they contacted Misha and tipped off what they were doing, she would tell her parents, who were actually her kidnappers, and then potentially they might take Misha and run away. And so they couldn't risk that. They had to basically follow her around and wait for an opening to get this DNA test done. And so this was also the reason why Cassidy was acting so strangely towards Misha in the few days before the truth was revealed. It's because Cassidy knew about this investigation, and the police told her, you can't tip Misha off. She will tell her parents, her kidnappers, and they might abscond with her. And so Cassidy basically felt awkward and kind of just hid from Misha for a couple of days. The woman that Misha had grown up with and called her mom for her whole life, LaVonna Solomon, was ultimately convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 10 years in prison. There has never been any evidence to suggest that LaVonna's husband, so Misha's dad for her whole life, actually knew that the baby had been kidnapped, because 17 years earlier, LaVonna had been pregnant with their child. But it's believed she miscarried, and LaVonna did not share that with her husband. Instead, she told her husband that she had gone into labor while he was at work and delivered their child, and so that's how they had this baby, Zephany, when in reality, after LaVonna had miscarried, she had at some point dressed up like a nurse, gone into the hospital, and stolen Zephany. For her part, Zephany, aka Misha, stayed in touch with both sets of parents, the fake ones and her biological ones. And she would say that, she still loves the parents who kidnapped her because they raised her and they treated her well. And in fact, Zephany would actually wear that beautiful flowing red dress that LaVonna had stitched for her to her high school dance, well after the news came out about who LaVonna was. Misha also decided that she would just keep the name Misha because that was what she was used to, instead of going back to her baby name, Zephany.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, Mr. Ballen Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts.